In a remote outpost, an elder rancher meets a terrified girl in need of help. Unaware that this encounter will ignite the fight of his life against corrupt lawmen who threaten everything, he holds dear was facing his final 3 days, an existence soon to conclude in solitude. The elder rancher sensed the chill of demise, pervading his very being much like a winter's first frost, and he had come to terms with this inevitable end. Yet as he rested on his veranda that morning, observing the dawn's hues transform the peaks into a golden spectacle, he remained unaware that a slight quiet form was already traversing his property. The entrance to the outbuilding groaned open precisely at 7:30, heard it from the main dwelling, and instinctively reached for his firearm. No one visited his isolated homestead anymore, not since the settlement had dismissed him as the reclusive eccentric more inclined to confront trespassers than to share a meal. But upon entering the structure, weapon poised, he encountered something that caused him to freeze. A young girl, perhaps 11 years of age, stood in the center of the outbuilding. Her attire was tattered and soiled, her dark hair matted with burrs and dust. She clutched a crumpled piece of paper in her small hand, and her Gazethos eyes held a profound terror, a look had recognized in his own reflection for 2 decades. The child showed no reaction to the sight of his firearm. She remained silent. Instead, she extended the paper with trembling hands, lowered his weapon, and advanced his arthritic joints, protesting with each step. The handwriting on the message was shaky, desperate. Please help Clementine. Bad men took her mama. She can't hear or speak. Trust no one in town. They're coming. Looked up at the child Clementine. She was studying his lips intently, and he realized she was deciphering them. The girl was hearing impaired, just as the note indicated, but there was something else in her expression, something that tightened his chest with an emotion he'd suppressed long ago. She was utterly, completely alone, just like him. The sound of approaching horses caused them both to turn toward the outbuilding's entrance. Clementine's eyes widened with fear, and she grasped his weathered hand with surprising strength. Through the gaps in the walls he could discern 3 riders rapidly approaching, their countenances grim and determined. But what witnessed next sent a shiver down his spine. The lead rider wore a lawman's badge and immediately recognized him. Deputy Marshal Wade Langston, the very individual who had been asking too many inquiries about missing families in these parts. Clementine tightened her grip and felt a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. The urgent impulse to safeguard someone other than himself. But as the riders drew nearer, he understood that assisting this child might well be his final act. The horses halted just beyond the outbuilding, could hear the creak of leather as the men dismounted, their spurs jangling against the hard-packed earth. Clementine pressed herself against the wall, her small frame trembling like a cornered creature, made a split-second choice that would alter everything. He snatched an old horse blanket and draped it over a pile of hay in the corner, then pointed toward Clementine. She understood instantly and dove beneath the blanket, vanishing from sight just as boots impacted the floor. Morning, Thatcher, Deputy Marshal Langston announced, stepping into the outbuilding, his hand casually resting on his weapon. The 2 men behind him fanned out, obstructing any possibility of escape. Heard, you might have seen something out of the ordinary this morning. Leaned against his pitchfork, attempting to project the image of the same ill-tempered recluse everyone anticipated. Only unusual thing I've witnessed is lawmen on my property without an invitation. Langston offered a smile devoid of warmth. We're searching for a little girl, about 11, dark hair, might be disoriented. He moved closer, his gaze sweeping every corner of the outbuilding. Her family had an accident. We're endeavoring to reunite her with her remaining relatives. The way he uttered accident made his skin crawl beneath the blanket. He could see Clementine's small form, perfectly still. The girl had learned to conceal herself, and that fact alone conveyed everything he needed to know about her ordeal. Haven't seen any children, stated flatly. Don't receive visitors, period. Too preoccupied with dying to entertain folks. One of the other men, a lean individual with cruel eyes, snorted. Yeah, we're aware of your condition, old man. Pity you're going to perish all by yourself out here, but that does give us an idea. He exchanged a knowing glance with Langston. What if we informed people you passed away yesterday? Naturally, quite peacefully. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Langston moved even nearer, close enough that could discern the scent of whiskey on his breath. See, if you're already deceased, no one's going to investigate when we conduct a proper search of this place, and if we locate what we're seeking. Felt his heart pounding against his ribs, yet not from fear, it was from fury. These men were threatening to murder him and hunt down a terrified child, and they were doing it While displaying badges, I told you stated slowly, I haven't seen any girl. Langston scrutinized his face for a prolonged moment, then gestured to his men, comb the place, every corner, every stall, every stack of hay. He turned back to, with that chilling smile, and old man, if you're deceiving us, your final days are going to become considerably more agonizing. As the men began to tear through his outbuilding upending equipment, and kicking through hay bales, caught a glimpse of movement. Beneath the blanket Clementine was stirring, and he could tell she was preparing to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The men had them cornered, and was about to discover the full extent of these corrupt lawmen's willingness to silence a hearing-impaired child who had witnessed too much. The thin man was 3 feet from Clementine's concealment. That's when made his move, intentionally knocking over a bucket of grain, sending it clattering across the floor. The noise caused all three men to pivot toward him, their hands moving to their weapons. Clumsy, old fool, Langston snarled. Can't even stand upright anymore. While they were diverted, saw Clementine slip out from under the blanket and dart behind the grain bins. The girl moved like a phantom, silent and swift, but knew it was only a matter of moments before they spotted her. You know what, Thatcher? Langston holstered his weapon and picked up a piece of broken harness. I believe you require some encouragement to recall what you might have seen. The leather strap struck across the shoulder, sending searing pain through his already aching body. But he had endured worse, much worse. He straightened and met Langston's gaze directly. Go ahead, said quietly. Assault an old man? That's precisely what I'd anticipate from someone who wears a badge and preys on children. The words struck their target. Langston's face flushed crimson, and he raised the strap again, but before he could strike, one of his men called out from the back of the outbuilding. Boss, found something. His heart lurched, but when he looked, the man was holding up an old photograph. Not Clementine, it was an image of with his wife and daughter, taken 30 years prior, before the fever claimed them both. Well, Langston remarked, snatching the photograph. Looks like our recluse wasn't always solitary. What happened to them, Thatcher? Let me guess, you couldn't shield them either. The brutality of the words cut deeper than any physical blow. Felt 2 decades of meticulously buried sorrow surge to the surface, but he forced himself to remain composed. Clementine was relying on him. They died of fever, he stated simply. Long time ago. Shame, Langston said, tearing the photograph in half. But at least they won't have to witness what transpires next. That's when noticed something. Clementine had moved again, positioning herself near the outbuilding's rear exit. The girl was astute. She was establishing an escape route, but she was also signaling something to him, tapping her finger against her palm in a pattern he didn't comprehend. Then it dawned on him. She was attempting to communicate. The child was conveying something vital, but he couldn't interpret her signs. Langston followed his gaze and turned toward the back of the outbuilding. His eyes narrowed as he scrutinized the shadows. What are you looking at? Old man forced himself to shrug. Nothing, just recollecting how this place used to appear when it mattered. But Langston was no longer convinced. He drew his weapon and began walking toward the grain bins, his boots echoing in the silence. Boys, I believe our friend here has been playing games with us. As Langston drew closer to Clementine's position, realized the time for deception was over. In the next few seconds, either the girl would be apprehended, or he would have to undertake an action that would likely result in both their deaths. Grabbed the pitchfork and swung it like a club, striking Langston across the back of the head. The deputy marshal stumbled forward, his firearm clattering to the ground, but the other 2 men reacted swiftly, drawing their weapons and pointing them directly at Move and you're dead, old man, the thin one shouted. But Clementine was already in motion. She burst from behind the grain bins and sprinted toward the back door, her bare feet silent on the dirt floor. One of the men swung his gun toward her, but lunged forward, seizing the man's arm and sending the shot astray. The bullet splintered wood above Clementine's head. As she dove through the rear exit, felt a surge of relief, but it was fleeting. Langston was back on his feet, blood trickling from his scalp, and his face was contorted with fury. You just committed the biggest error of your life, Thatcher, he snarled, retrieving his weapon. Now, we're going to make you observe while we hunt down that little witness to what demanded. Though he was already beginning to comprehend, Langston's smile was pure malice. To what happened to her mama and papa, to what happens to families who don't settle their debts with the right people. That little girl saw everything, and she's the only one remaining who can connect us to those burned out homesteads the pieces fell into place like dominoes. The missing families, the unexplained fires, the corrupt lawmen who were supposed to be protecting people. Langston and his men weren't merely pursuing Clementine. They were concealing murder. How many? Asked quietly. How many? What? How many families? Have you killed? Langston shrugged. Business is business. Some folks just won't heed reason about paying their protection fees. But don't fret, you won't be present to judge us. The thin man had moved to the back door and was scanning the landscape. She's heading for the creek, boss. Little thing swift, but she won't get far on foot. Good, Langston said. We'll track her down like a rabbit. But first he turned back to raising his weapon. We conclude what we began here, closed his eyes thinking of his wife and daughter after 30 years of guilt and solitude. Perhaps it wasn't such an unfortunate way to go, attempting to save an innocent child. But then he heard something that caused him to open his eyes again. Horses, many of them, approaching rapidly through the front entrance of the outbuilding, could see dust clouds nearing from the main road. Langston heard it too, and his confident expression flickered with uncertainty. Who the hell is that? The thin man asked, but was observing something else through the back door. He could see Clementine crouched behind a fallen log near the creek. She wasn't running anymore, she was watching, and in her small hands she held something that made his heart leap. A signal mirror. The girl was flashing sunlight toward the approaching riders, sending them some form of message. But to whom was she signaling, and how did she know they were coming? Langston perceived the flashing light at the same instant. Did his face paled with realization? It's a trap, he whispered. The little devil led us straight into a trap. As the sound of horses grew louder, began to understand that Clementine wasn't merely a terrified refugee, she was something far more dangerous. A child who had learned to fight back. The riders burst into view like thunder across the plains, 6 men on horseback, their faces resolute as granite, their weapons already drawn. But these were not more corrupt. Lawmen could discern by their movements, their positioning. These were hunters, and they were hunting Langston. The lead rider was a tall man with silver hair and scars across his weathered face. He dismounted, while his horse was still moving, and strode toward the outbuilding with lethal intent. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority someone who had witnessed too much death to be impressed by badges or threats. Deputy Marshal Langston, the man called out. Been looking for you. Langston's gun hand was trembling now. Who the hell are you? Name's Captain Ezra Whitmore. These are my rangers, and you, son, are under arrest for murder, extortion, and about a dozen other charges. The thin man beside Langston whispered frantically, boss, we have to depart right now. But there was no escape. The rangers had surrounded the outbuilding, their rifles aimed at every exit. Found himself caught in the midst of a standoff that had been escalating for months. You have no jurisdiction here, Captain Langston asserted, attempting to sound confident. I'm a federal deputy marshal. Whitmore laughed. But there was no mirth in it. Federal? Boy, the genuine federal marshals have been tracking you since you incinerated the Henderson family. That badge you're wearing, it's as fraudulent as your tale about assisting that little girl through the back door. Could see Clementine still crouched by the creek, but now he understood her actions. The girl hadn't stumbled into his outbuilding by chance. She had led Langston and his men directly into a trap, using his ranch as bait. The child called out to Whitmore. She's safe by the creek. Whitmore nodded to one of his men, who rode toward Clementine's position, but Langston wasn't finished. Desperation made him perilous, and could see the wild glint in his eyes that preceded men opening fire. You wish to know about witnesses? Captain Langston snarled. That little girl saw her parents burn, she watched her baby brother perish in the flames, and you know what? We savored every moment of it. The words were intended to provoke, but they had the opposite effect. Whitmore became completely still, his hand steady on his weapon. Surrender now, Langston, last chance. Instead, Langston seized by the throat and pressed his weapon to the old rancher's temple. Here's what will transpire. You're going to permit us to ride out of here, or this old hermit dies right now. But was not the same broken man who had awakened expecting to die alone. Something had transformed within him. The instant Clementine took his hand for the first time in 30 years, he possessed something worth contending for. Don't make deals for me, Captain said quietly. Do what is necessary. And that's when everything erupted into violence. If you're enjoying this story of courage and redemption, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will show you just how far a dying man will go to protect an innocent child. Drove his elbow back into Langston's ribs. With every ounce of strength his fading body could muster, the deputy marshal's grip loosened just enough for it to break free and dive to the side. Gunfire erupted from every direction as the rangers engaged Langston's men. The thin man took a bullet to the chest and spun backward into a pile of hay. The third man attempted to flee but advanced only 3 steps before Whitmore's rifle brought him down, but Langston was swift and desperate, rolling behind a water trough and returning fire, crawled toward his pitchfork, his joints screaming in protest. A bullet splintered the wood near his head, showering him with fragments, but all he could focus on was Clementine. The child had entrusted him with her protection, and he was not about to fail her through the chaos. He saw Langston making a dash for the back door. The corrupt lawman was attempting to reach Clementine, likely calculating that he could use her as a hostage to escape, but was closer. The old rancher lunged forward, tackling Langston around the legs. Both men went down hard, Langston's weapon skittering across the dirt floor. They grappled desperately, but was rapidly losing strength. His heart was pounding erratically, and dark spots danced at the edges of his vision. Langston gained the upper hand, his hands around his throat. Should have minded your own affairs, old man. Now you're going to die for nothing. But Langston was mistaken, was not dying for nothing. He was dying for something precious. The opportunity to grant one innocent child a future. And that made all the difference. With his last reserves of strength, reached for the pitchfork, his fingers closed around the handle. Just as his vision began to tunnel, he drove the pointed end upward. With everything he had left, Langston's eyes widened with shock. He looked down at the tines protruding from his chest, then back at with disbelief. You killed me? Yeah, whispered. I did. Langston collapsed beside him, his breathing shallow and labored. The gunfire had ceased, and could hear Captain Whitmore instructing his men to secure the area, but his own breathing was becoming labored. The struggle had depleted all his energy. He rolled onto his back and gazed up at the outbuilding rafters, oddly peaceful. It felt, knowing he had acted honorably at the end. His wife and daughter would be proud of him. He thought for once in 30 years he had chosen to fight instead of conceal himself. Footsteps approached, and Captain Whitmore knelt beside him. Easy, their old-timer. We'll get you some aid. Shook his head weakly. No aid for what I have, Captain, but the girl, is she's safe. My men located her by the creek. Brave little thing. She's been tracking these murderers for weeks, leaving clues for us to follow. Led us directly to their hideout. Smiled. Clementine wasn't just a survivor. She was a fighter, a warrior in the body of an 11-year-old girl. Captain, he wheezed, that child, she has no one left when I'm gone. Don't you worry about that, Whitmore said gently. We'll ensure she's cared for. You have my word. Through the outbuilding door, could see Clementine walking toward them, flanked by 2 rangers. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were luminous with something he had never witnessed before. Hope. Clementine knelt beside and placed her small hand on his weathered cheek. Even through his fading vision, he could perceive the gratitude in her dark eyes. She was attempting to convey something, her fingers moving in patterns he still couldn't fathom, but her meaning was unambiguous. Thank you, Captain Whitmore observed the silent exchange. With respect, she wishes to know if you have any family, any place you'd like to be interred. Looked around his outbuilding, at the place he had called home for 30 years. Here's fine, he whispered, next to my wife and daughter up on the hill behind the house. Clementine's fingers moved again, more urgently. This time, Whitmore translated. She says she knows about your family. She found their graves when she was hiding. She's been keeping them clean. A tear traced a path down his cheek. This child, who had lost everything, had been preserving his family's memory. It was more compassion than he had received in 3 decades of self-imposed solitude. Captain said, his voice barely audible now, there's something in my house, a wooden box under the floorboards in the bedroom. Money, not much, but for the girl. Whitmore nodded. We'll find it. Anything else? Looked at Clementine again. She was still holding his hand, her grip surprisingly firm for such a small person. Tell her she gave me something I believed I'd lost forever. What's that? A reason to live, even if it was just for one day. Clementine seemed to comprehend. Without translation, she leaned forward and kissed his forehead, then pressed something into his palm. It was the crumpled note she had carried into his outbuilding that morning, the desperate plea for assistance that had changed everything. But now he could discern additional writing on the back in a child's careful script. Thank you for not being afraid of me, Mama said. There are angels who look like regular people. I think you are one. Closed his eyes, feeling a peace he hadn't known since his family died. The pain in his chest was receding, replaced by something warm and light. For the first time in 30 years, he was not dying alone. He was surrounded by people who cared, protected by rangers who fought for justice, and held by a child who had chosen to trust him with her life. Captain Whitmore's voice seemed to emanate from very far away. Thatcher, can you hear me? But was already elsewhere, ascending a familiar hill where 2 graves waited under the oak tree, and there, standing beside the headstones, were the 2 individuals he had missed more than life itself. His wife Sarah was smiling, her hand extended toward him. His daughter Emma was there too, no longer the ailing child who died in his arms, but healthy and whole and beautiful. Took you long enough, Sarah said. Gently, we've been waiting behind him in the world. He was departing, could hear Clementine learning to utter her first words aloud, guided by Captain Whitmore's patient voice. The child would have a future, now a chance to mature safely and loved, passed away. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, his hand still clasped in Clementine's small fingers, Captain Whitmore closed the old rancher's eyes and stood slowly removing his hat. In reverence, the outbuilding had fallen completely silent save for the gentle sound of wind through the gaps in the walls. Clementine stood beside the body for a prolonged moment, her tears falling silently onto his chest. Then she walked to the corner where she had hidden that morning and retrieved something from behind the grain bin. It was a small bouquet of wildflowers, carefully picked and arranged. She placed them on his chest and stepped back. She'd been gathering those since dawn, one of the rangers said quietly. Must have known how this would conclude. Captain Whitmore found the wooden box exactly where had indicated. Inside were $300 in gold coins, a faded photograph of as a young man with his family, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this. The letter was simple but potent. I lived 30 years waiting to die, but in my last day, I remembered what it meant to be alive. Take care of the child. She saved my soul. As the rangers prepared to depart, Clementine walked to the hillside where Sarah and Emma Thatcher were buried. She knelt beside the weathered headstones and used her hands to clear away the weeds, just as she had been doing for weeks. But now she was preparing a third grave. Captain Whitmore found her there as the sun began to set. You don't have to stay for the burial, he said gently. We can take you somewhere safe tonight. But Clementine shook her head and pointed to the house, then to herself. Her meaning was clear. She wished to spend one more night here in the place where she had found safety and kindness. All right, Whitmore agreed. But tomorrow, we head to Silver Creek. There's a family there, the Parkers. They've been looking to adopt a child. Good people with a daughter about your age. Clementine nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the three graves. She was bidding farewell, not just to, but to the last vestige of her old life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to trust, new ways to articulate her needs and dreams. As night fell, Clementine sat on his porch, wrapped in one of his old blankets. She could see the stars beginning to emerge, the same stars that had watched over her terrifying journey from her burned home to this ranch, but now they seemed different. Not cold and distant, but warm and welcoming. In her pocket, she carried two items: the original note that had brought her to his outbuilding, and a new one she had written herself. This one was addressed to her future family, and it stated simply, "My name is Clementine. I cannot hear your words, but I can see your kindness. An angel taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust a stranger." The next morning, as Captain Whitmore loaded her few possessions onto his horse, Clementine took one last look at the ranch, the outbuilding where she had concealed herself, the house where she had found sanctuary, the hill where three individuals now rested in peace. She pressed her hand to her heart, then to her lips, then blew a kiss toward his grave. Had spent 30 years believing he was isolated in the world, but in his final hours he unearthed something profound. We are never truly alone as long as we are willing to extend ourselves to others, and sometimes the person who needs saving the most is the one who chooses to be the savior. As they rode away towards Silver Creek and Clementine's new life, Captain Whitmore smiled behind them. The ranch stood quiet and peaceful, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the remembrance of one perfect day when a dying man and a frightened child had saved each other. If you enjoyed this story of courage, sacrifice, and the power of human connection, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales from the American West. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video. What did you think of the rancher's sacrifice? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more captivating stories.